So today is Thursday, July 20th, 2023. My name is Grace Park, and I'm interviewing Dr. Minjae Kim on behalf of the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice University. So first, I'll be asking you a few questions related to your early life. So when and where were you born?
So I was born in Seoul, South Korea. I was born in 1988.
Um, how would you describe your childhood and adolescence years in Korea? And specifically, what are some of the special holidays, traditions, or memories you recall growing up?
Yes. So I don't think so. I grew up in Seoul, South Korea for my until I went to Colorado for high school. So I was in Korea until when I was 16, and I had a relatively, normal but privileged childhood in Korea. Like, for example, so my parents and me and my sister, so I have an older sister. We lived in this like the southern part of Seoul where I went to very good school. Although, I went to public school, but public schools in that part are, very good. And so I was very privileged that way. So my parents were from like this southern, southwestern part of Korea, of South Korea. So, my grandparents still lived in that part when I was little. So on big holidays like like Chuseok or like or the New Year's, we would drive down there and we would drive like I don't know like 12 hours, even though Korea is a relatively small country, like it would take that long. And we would go there, spend 3 4 days, and we would come back. And when I was little, my father still, most people still worked on Saturdays. Saturdays were like a half holiday, so my father would go to work. My mom, we were a relatively very traditional family, for better or worse. So my mom mostly worked at home, to take care of me and my sister. So like I had a, I would say very privileged background, where I didn't have to worry about, the food or security, stuff like that. And I could just focus on studying, even though I was not very good at it. And I could just, worry about hanging out with my friends, essentially.
I see. The next question is, what were your parents' occupations, and what are some of the values and lessons that your parents instilled in you?
Yeah. So my mom used to work in essentially, we would call it like the Federal Reserve of Korea. So she used to work there until she got married, and then she quit to take care of us. And then my father worked in the finance industry. Although like it's interesting because like whenever people meet him, my father, they would always ask me or my sister like if my father is a teacher or a professor, because he was always kind of like he always has has had that vibe. And also just a little bit more background is my sister is also a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also a professor. So me being also an academic, I think there's a reason for that, and the reason is I think my father and mother always just like they never like kind of put their own thoughts. They never like force their thoughts into our heads. They always kind of ask us to think about it, think about different stuff, and had us come up with our own answers. Sometimes it backfires in that, when I was in the 12, 13, 14, I would want to do whatever I wanted to do. So and they sometimes didn't like the answers that I came up with, but they always kind of had me think about stuff. And that kind of conversations that happened at the lunch tables and dinner tables, they really definitely helped me think about stuff in our own way, which I think was a big impetus in a lot of what me and my sister are doing right now.
Let's see. The next question is, what was your favorite subject in school, and what were some of your aspirations or any dream career as a child?
I see. So I always liked social studies. I identify myself as a sociologist right now. So somebody who studies organizations, a sociologist who studies organizations in the business school. Um, and uh, and I've always liked that subject. I liked history. My high school didn't have like a social studies as a subject, so I liked history. I also liked English, so it was always social sciences. I never had a question about like whether I would major in anything related to social sciences. I always knew that. It was a question of which of the social sciences I would major in college. Um, I did not like, math or science. I still am not a very good math or science person. Um, so that was that. What was the other question? Sorry.
What were some of your aspirations or any dream
Ah,
career as a child?
yeah. So, I don't know. I at one point I wanted to be like a journalist, kind of the investigative journalist. At one point I wanted to be like a lawyer. Um, I always wanted to do something kind of along that line, kind of like asking questions and trying to answer. Although, they do, investigative journalists and lawyers, they do things very differently. Um, I never thought of like an academic as a profession or a career that I, wanted to be, partly because I didn't really know what it entailed. Most people, including some of the students that I teach probably think that, I just teach and that's all I do, which is fair, that's all they see. Um, but like more of what academics do, at least at Rice University, have to do with like research. And it's hard to know what research is until you do it or until you see it and stuff like that. So I didn't really have a good idea about it. So that's so lawyer or journalist were kind of oscillating thoughts when I was growing up.
I see. Next to talk a little bit about your immigration experience. Could you tell us when you moved to the States and how and why it happened?
Mhm. So as I had said before, I, come from a very privileged background. So when I was finishing up my middle school in Korea, um, I did not want to go to high school in Korea. And one of the reasons was because, there's a high level of competition in South Korean education system. And I always saw my sister, who is 1 year older. She's always been a good student, and I saw her, and I was like, I'm not gonna be able to do that. So a big part of me was like, I want to escape this education system. I wanted to, play soccer. If you go to high school in Korea, you don't play soccer as often. So that was a big part, and I could, I was in a privileged position to be able to ask my parents to send me off to school in the US. So we essentially started looking at different schools in the US, and it was relatively late in the cycle. I couldn't go to public school in the US because I didn't have citizenship or a green card or anything. And so I had to go to private school, and it was relatively late in the cycle of the private school. So I just ended up applying to kind of a handful of private schools in the US. Um, and then I ended up choosing Colorado. Not because I knew anything about Colorado, but because, it had the same latitude as Korea. So I was like, oh, it must be kind of the similar weather kind of stuff. So I chose Colorado, and then I came in 2004 when I was I think when I was 15. So um that's essentially when I came and I started high school. So that's kind of the beginning of my chapter, almost, 19 years ago.
I see. To elaborate on that move a little bit, so what was the transition from Korea to the States like? And what were some of the most striking differences that you noticed?
Yeah, so the transition I think was, relatively smooth for a couple different reasons. One was that I went to a boarding school. So the boarding school had a lot of kids away from home. So I didn't necessarily feel like that I was the only one away from home. Other people also didn't have parents with them when they went to my high school. So that was in a way helpful. And my high school had a lot of other Korean students as well. So that was helpful too. Um, Another reason was like I was young enough to be able to kind of pick up different stuff. I could speak English relatively well. I think I always say that I spoke English well enough to be able to, understand things in the classroom. But I really couldn't understand what was going on outside of the classroom because, the language that you use, the vernacular you use outside of classroom is slightly different. So, but I knew enough to be able to get by, and then I was young enough to kind of have the learning curve go up. Um, the biggest difference might have been, I was so in a school setting, so it was a relatively controlled setting. So in a way, a lot of differences that I felt came later when I was in college, when I was interacting with, quote unquote, real people outside of school. Like to be able to learn about, different factors of inequality in the US, different kind of social stratification in the US that might have been different or that I did not appreciate when I was in Korea, stuff like that. But the biggest difference that I felt when I was in high school was essentially like that they didn't put that much pressure on studying, which was helpful for me at that point because I was very like, I want to do, what I want to do essentially. So I would have it would have backfired essentially if somebody was telling me that. And also like that, it was lots of what kind of drove people were self-motivation. People did what they wanted to do. Like I had a friend who was like really into films, and she was making all these films, and she was kind of volunteering her time to do so. Nobody was telling her to do so, and then she was essentially just going after her passion. So that was very different. That was allowed by the high school structure. And it's definitely both ways, but that was the biggest difference when I started high school.
I see. To talk a little bit about your immigration experience now, I see that you've been at Rice/Houston since 2020. So how would you describe the Asian American community in Houston in comparison with other cities that you've lived in?
I see. So to be honest, and I think it would be the case for a lot of people who moved during the COVID, I don't think I know the city as well as I should. For two reasons. One is that because I moved in the middle of the COVID, so I couldn't get out as much. The second reason is that my wife actually lives in New York right now, New York City. So I go back and forth quite a bit. So that definitely cuts my time spent in Houston. So I don't know the city of Houston not as well as I should, not because of of how Houston is, just because of the timing and my personal situation um so far. So given that the so Houston community, so the Korean community, I don't know, for that reason, I don't know as much about the Korean American or the Asian American community in Houston. One thing that I noticed was that and another factor is like the way people look at me is also different. Not because how Houston is, but because now I'm no longer a student. I've always been in some kind of student position before Rice. I was a postdoc at Northwestern, or in Evanston or Chicago before here, but that still kind of is like a student. Um, so I think that part is also different. What I like about Houston and Asian American community is it seems a little bit more integrated than maybe Boston, Chicago, or definitely Colorado. Um, both within the Asian American community, but also between the Asian American community and the other communities. I see Houston as for whatever reason more integrated in many different ways that way. I don't know if it is statistically or factually true. Like there are my colleagues who study the social integration, so I should ask them about it. But it seems like the Asian American communities are more integrated, and I enjoy that. Kind of makes me easier to kind of go back and forth that community and the outer kind of the community as well. So that's kind of something that I think about how I think about the Asian American community in Houston.
I see. And adding on a little bit, out of Korea and the different US cities that you have lived in, which place would you call home and why?
It's hard. Yeah, that definitely is hard. The first answer I would give is like I don't know. And the second answer is, so my parents still live in Korea. So if I had to pick one place, I would call that home. But at the same time, like I feel very, very close to Colorado. Most of my friends are in Colorado, my high school friends at least. And I go there like, once every other year or once every year. And whenever I do that, I really feel at home. So it was a big moment for me to take my now wife, but then girlfriend to Colorado. Um, and even though I have no relatives in Colorado right now, um so that and I think some people have told me that like the first place that they immigrated to is their American home or something. That's definitely true to me. That's been the case since I moved here. Yeah.
That was a difficult question, but thank you for your response.
No, of course. Yeah.
Um, and now to move on to some questions regarding your college experience and education. Could you describe your undergraduate years at the University of Chicago in terms of your academic interest or how you changed as a person throughout the 4 years?
Yeah. So I often, tell my wife or other people that I formed my personality when I was in high school, and I like kind of formed who I am as an academic when I was at U Chicago. So essentially I just studied a lot at U Chicago. I mean the place is a little bit of a pressure cooker that makes you do that. Also, like my high school was not, it was a, very, very good private boarding school, but it was not like a, super academic pressure cooker. So it was a little bit of a culture shock in a way that like, everyone was very intellectually driven and academic. So I had to essentially play a little bit of a catch up. Um, and I learned more from like my peers than from classrooms. Like, the conversations that happened in the dorm and on Saturday nights, like I learned more from them than in classrooms. And before that I had never been in that that kind of environment. Even though like, my friends from high school are very, very smart. We just did not have that kind of the environment. Talk about that kind of intellectually stimulating things. Um, the and also the U Chicago was the first time that I essentially got exposed to the broader kind of Asian American or the Korean American community. Because in Colorado, I lived in the dorm, there were only a handful of other Korean students. We were all, young enough that, or little enough that, um, you know, but in there were more kind of diverse Asian American community in college. I think for most people's case as well. So that was definitely a big eye-opening thing too. Like I learned that oh these there are these kind of the direct imports of the Korean culture here. Very, very different kind of transformation of the Korean culture there. Absence of Korean culture there. So it was definitely a learning curve to kind of get to know the Korean American and the Asian American community.
I see. Did you have any professors, mentors, or fellow students who left a significant impact on your life, either academically, socially, or otherwise?
Yes, academically there were a few people. One, I still keep in touch with them, partly because they are in kind of our field, my current field too. You know, they definitely, two of them, Amanda Sharkey and Gary Harrigal, they really kind of have had a big intellectual slash academic influence on me. Like I still, to some extent, I still think like them and stuff like that. There was another professor whose name is Cho Sung Lee, who's back in Korea now, who was a faculty member at U Chicago. Um, he had a big influence on me. He's Korean. And he was really like the first Korean academic that I got to know. And he was studying things that were very, very interesting. So I think either implicitly or explicitly, I think I learned of him as a role model. He was very active. He was very successful in his career. Also he was, I think, he's a very good person. So even though like I was not really personally close with him, he had a big kind of the role model kind of influence on me that way.
I see. Thank you for your response. And how would you compare and contrast your education experience in Korea versus the States, both from like a student and an instructor point of view?
I see. So from the student point of view, I think there was a lot more freedom in the US. That I really liked that. I could kind of go off and do my own thing, which I really enjoyed, and I think that really made me they really allowed me to become the academic that I am right now. At the same time, I think my mom always tells me like I study only what I want to study. So and like in general, like I'm not interested in the things that I'm not interested in. And I don't do the things that I don't want to do. So um like that kind of attitude kind of carried through me. Whereas in the Korean education system, you would need to study what, even if you don't want to study that. And to some extent, you learn from that. You are not, um, you open your eyes to new things that you didn't think you would learn anything from. So I think I'm a little bit kind of shoehorned that way because I've been in the U.S. education system. As an instructor, I only know of the kind of the US system. I've never been an instructor in Korea, so I know less about that. Um, but it's interesting, like part of what people often say is like, oh, like I grew up in, like somebody would say like, oh, they grew up in, Korea. So like they do things in a very formulaic way and stuff like that. And I always say like the Korean education system really got me to think creatively, partly because I had to do the things that I didn't want to do. And it like pushes you to different directions. So in a way, I think I often disagree with those statements because like the Korean education system pushes you to think about ways in different ways, whereas the US education system has made me allowed me to do the things that I want to do, but sometimes, lets me do, kind of get shoehorned in one way. Yeah.
I see. Now to jump into some questions regarding your career. Could you tell us how you came to pursue a career in teaching and specifically a university professor? And also, why is teaching important to you? And what do you hope to achieve as a professor?
Yeah, of course. So I think so as a faculty member, like the teaching as well as research, I think they are very intertwined. And I've always been interested in teaching, especially undergrads, MBAs too, definitely. And MBAs think in a very different ways than undergrads. So I learn different things from teaching them. Um, Partly because I want them to the critical thinking, and I think the way in which that kind of learning how to think is a big part that I try to. I don't know if I'm always successful. That I try to make sure that my students are able to learn in my classrooms. Um, it's always I often learn more than I teach when I teach. So like the topics that I think I talk about in each class year after year are similar, not exactly the same, but similar. The conversations that happen from on those topics are very, very different year to year. That often reflects how much they are teaching me and in their own critical thinking way. At the undergrad level, they're already at the level where they can kind of think about things in a very, very critical way. So that's kind of the biggest pleasure I get. Like it's more of the conversations. And I would imagine I've never taught a high school or middle schoolers. So but I would imagine that, that's more achievable with the undergrad, university teaching, college teaching. So that's definitely pulled me in.
See. The next question would be, could you describe your experience of teaching at the Jones Graduate School of Business? And what would you say are some of the most impactful moments in your teaching career at Rice so far?
Yes. So I mean, one thing that I really enjoy about teaching at Jones is that kind of going off of the same theme, like the students are very motivated, very smart, very driven to really push me and teach, kind of teach me stuff as well. Whether it is like kind of the substantive stuff there about like what's going on in the business or the economy or the society, but also like they think about they kind of push me to think in different ways than I had thought before. Um, so the the sorry. Also, and also the one thing that I really enjoy, both at the MBA level and the undergrad level, is that they come from very diverse backgrounds. Not only kind of personally, but also like disciplinarily. Like, some of them come from engineering, some of them come from, humanities. Partly because they would, often the businesses they're kind of the second major. So that and like I am really able to learn a lot from them. When they come from different field, they really give me different perspectives. So I think I would imagine that that's particular to Jones School, Jones Graduate School of Business, because partly because people shop around the different business classes, and that's really helped me.
Adding on to your response a little bit, so you mentioned like the diversity of the backgrounds and students. How do you think your background and kind of your upbringing influences your teaching?
Oh yeah, definitely. So it helps me in two ways. One is um that it always I don't know if I'm always good at it, but at least it sensitizes me to kind of the fact that are different perspectives out there, that the perspective that I'm teaching them is not the only perspective that they will have or they should have. I think that's definitely it. The second thing is more pedagogically or kind of as a strategy. I often use my kind of the immigrant slash racial status as an example. So I teach one of the topics that I teach is, discrimination. And I explicitly ask them as an exercise, I explicitly ask them, what are some of the reasons why, let's see if they see a resume that comes from somebody who went to Rice University versus who did not go to Rice University, but who went to local high school, what would you prefer? And I have them think about different stuff. I sometimes, and then I have them think about like, between the incarcerated citizen and a non-incarcerated citizen. And then I have them think about, an Asian male versus non-Asian male when they are trying to recruit someone for some kind of quantitative job. It's obviously, like it's obvious an exercise to kind of push, force them to think about different stuff, the factors that are used to discriminate. And I think that kind of exercise, I can use partly because of my own racial status and the immigrant status. Yeah.
I see, thank you for your response. And the next question is, I read a little bit about this on your resume, but I'm interested in the Granovetter's weak tie theory, and I see that you've made a study on this theory. So could you elaborate on your study a little bit?
I see. So that study is a co-author study with one of my kind of the PhD advisors at MIT. And this is a review study, which means that it's essentially a review of the literature that has talked about that theory. So it's not really like a quote unquote original study in that I have some kind of a new theory around it. But it's essentially kind of assessing, how much do we know about the theory? How much do we not know about the theory and stuff like that. So, as with any sciences, both the social sciences and the physical sciences or biological sciences, there is a theory and then there is evidence. And this weak ties theory is essentially that somebody is more likely to get a job through a weak tie than a strong tie. And that came across as very counterintuitive when it was published, which is in 1973. That partly because people always expected to get jobs from close friends or family members or something like that. And his theory was that people are more likely to get jobs through weak ties because weak ties are more likely to be ties to somebody who is in a different social circle than you are. And because that tie is more likely to be weak, but that tie is also more likely to be quote unquote distant or long, socially long. So they're going to give you different kind of information than the one that you already have. So your family and friends are going to know the information that you already have, the job information that you already have. Whereas somebody who is connected to you through a weak tie is more likely to give you information that you don't know. So that's why that person is more likely to give you the job, essentially job information that's helpful. And subsequent, for the past 50 years that there have been a lot of studies that try to test this empirically, meaning that try to kind of give evidence to it one way or another. So that review piece, the paper was essentially trying to assess, how much do we know? Like what kind of evidence do we have for the theory? What kind of evidence do we not have for the theory? What kind of questions still remain? So that was essentially what we're trying to do in that paper.
Thank you. Next question, it's more centered on your study itself, but how valuable is it for corporations and other institutions to understand leadership, organizational dynamics, and the use of networking? And how would you say, or would you say that these elements also apply in government or schools or any other type of associations?
So definitely yes. So one of the big umbrellas that I study, and my colleagues in the same department study, is essentially the umbrella of organizations. So the dynamics and the theories that we try to come up with about, let's say, the private corporations or the public corporations, they should, to some extent, not always, to some extent, apply to governments, nonprofits, schools, and stuff like that. So my colleagues are mostly psychologists who study kind of the how the individuals respond to different kind of things that are happening in their organization or outside the organization, and I'm more of a sociologist who's tried to kind of put that in the kind of the broader perspective, so to speak. I specifically, I teach, so my class is called the leading people in organizations. I study relatively little about leadership per se, but I study more about how individuals kind of interact with their organization or the kind of society more generally. So I think that's definitely applicable to the government and education. And that said, obviously, many things are different in that some of the incentive systems in the government are going to be different from the incentive systems in the kind of the for-profit corporations. So they would obviously, need to be taken into account.
Let's see. I read this from an article featuring you as one of the 2022 best undergraduate professors. And you mentioned that you'd like to see more students doing research in business school. And I believe you mentioned this in one of the earlier questions as well. And doing research in business school seems a little contrary to the common misconception. But could you refer to a few topics that you consider to be valuable for students' research in business?
Yes. So let me think. So one of the papers that I have published with a colleague is this paper on ratings and on the online platform. So we essentially look at we look at beer. So first of all, favorite topic of college students, and also we essentially look at how reviewers on this online platform, is essentially Yelp for beer. Like the people go on there, and it's called beeradvocate.com. They go on there and then they rate different beers and stuff like that. And we essentially look at how that review ratings change. Do they, the beer presumably stays the same in terms of its quality, but the review ratings change depending on who has reviewed the beer before, and what kind of people who have reviewed the beer before. So we try to kind of get the data from that website and try to predict kind of what the next rating is going to be, and we have our own theory about it, and we test the theory and stuff like that. I think it would be super cool if cool for undergrads to kind of get involved in this kind of project, because they can really look at how do consumers respond to this kind of the market dynamics, And also it kind of gives, they can really learn essential skills if they want to be, let's say, data scientists or some kind of a some kind of data person, big data person in different kind of in the firms, even if they don't go into academia, because they can run different kind of statistical programs. They can learn how the data are structured. So those elements, I think, can be learned through the research. I think another aspect of the research that that is perhaps underappreciated is that they really have to come up with a problem solving skills. It's often that there is rarely a straight line from the beginning to the end in research. There are always unexpected turns, and people really have to come up with the creative solutions. And I think that can be really learned in research. That kind of problem solving skill. I mean, any jobs have some kind of problem solving skills, and I think research definitely has that too.
I see. How do you see yourself motivating and inspiring students to develop the enthusiasm towards studying social dynamics as a career, and better yet, to pursue a career in teaching?
Yes. Well, first of all, I don't think it's for everyone. Not because it's hard or easy, just because people are interested in different things. I think it's for the people who are very intrinsically curious, because I've seen a lot of cases where people do research to, quote unquote, change the world. And I think that can be done. It's not impossible, but there are a lot of steps between doing the research and change the world. There are lots of steps that can be, I think, done more effectively by somebody who's not a researcher. So I think somebody who really is interested in the phenomenon and the social dynamics in and of itself, I think that's kind of the better job for them. Something that I always encourage people to do is like essentially, try your hands on it first. It's relatively low cost thing. They can try for a semester. They can do it during the school year. They don't have to take the whole internship out of it. And that they can really, they can try it relatively easily, and they can work with a professor that they really liked. So that can be often a good motivation too.
See, for a couple questions regarding specifically Asian American and organizational behavior. As an Asian American yourself, have you ever considered research on social causes from the perspective of different ethnic groups or sampling groups of different origin?
Yeah, I always think about it, and I always want to do it. But part of it is that that it's not really my like expert field, that I sometimes feel a little bit afraid to kind of go into different field. Partly because I just don't know much about it. But I'm definitely an avid reader of that field. And I think there is a lot to study for the Asian Americans in organizational kind of dynamics. To take the most recent example, there was the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action. There are lots of kind of debates to hash out between different kind of racial groups too, about how they are receiving it. I saw some kind of poll about how, perhaps contrary to the popular beliefs, that Asian Americans actually, thought of the affirmative action as positive before the ruling as well as after. But at the same time, what are some of the kind of the perceptions toward the Asian Americans, within for the kind of selection into these universities, as well as how do Asian Americans perceive it? That's a very organizational problem as I see it, as well as a kind of a societal problem too. I see a lot of stuff to be done, and I hope that I can do it in the near future. So that's, yeah, I hope I can do it sometime in the near future.
Yes, adding on to your response a little bit, what is your view on how Asian Americans are regarded in the American education system, in regards to ideas such as model minority?
Yeah, so I think so it is really, really tough. And I think the part of it is that there is that common kind of stereotype about Asian Americans as kind of hardworking but not creative. You know, the personality wise, like, you know, somebody who is a good follower but not a good leader. But also, you know, kind of like a, you know, quote unquote sneaky, you know, stuff, all stuff like that. That I think those stereotypes definitely persist and exist. Um, Another aspect of this is, I think, as with any racial groups, kind of the non-Asian Americans see Asian Americans as more homogenous than Asian Americans actually are. First of all, you know, even within Rice University, there is an Asian Americans who were, you know, born and grew up in the U.S. You know, there are Asian Americans who immigrated when they were little. There are Asian Americans who came when they're, you know, for college, you know, stuff like that. And they have very different backgrounds, you know, different perspectives on things. So I think that kind of diversity is often overlooked. I think there is a little bit more appreciation of this in the public narrative now. After I think some people found out that, you know, like that Asian Americans have higher median wage than the white Americans in general, but Asian Americans have the highest variance, meaning, you know, highest kind of spread, you know, so that some Asian Americans earn a lot, some Asian Americans earn really little. So I think that heterogeneity is a little bit more appreciated, but it's still not enough. I think the diversity among Asian Americans is something that should be more appreciated. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your input in that. And next to move on onto a little bit of about your identity. Um, what aspect of yourself as an immigrant to the US are you the most proud of?
I see. Uh, Let me think. Um, I think part of it, I mean, perhaps it it should be this way, but I am proud of the fact that I still speak relatively good Korean, still, um, you know, I'm proud of the fact that I'm still very Korean in a way that doesn't, you know, that still makes, like, I still identify myself as Korean. I don't think it's really surprising because I didn't come when I was like, you know, 5. I came when I was 15. So I don't think anybody who comes at 15, you know, would forget Korean. But, you know, I still kind of keep updated, like I still am updated about like the Korean news. You know, I know the Korean news as well as the US news, if not more about Korean news. And I think that really kind of keeps me grounded. Um, I did not appreciate the Koreanness until, let's say, college. You know, I had a very kind of the binary mindset of like a mainstream US, which is, you know, white America, and you know, and kind of the Asian American community as kind of the peripheral. Um, and you know, after college, I kind of started appreciating, you know, what it means to be Asian American in the US a little bit more. I think part of it is growing up, part of it is just the time that I spend in the US. Part of it is just meeting more people. So, but I am very proud of the fact that I am, you know, still very Korean after spending 19 years in the US. Yeah.
I see. Thank you for your response. The next question is, are there any extracurricular activities or hobbies that you enjoy engaging in?
I like playing soccer, but I haven't been able to play soccer as much as I wish I have. My wife and I started, you know, playing tennis. We are horrible at it, but we started playing with one another, and we've been enjoying that a lot. So that's that. My wife is also academics. She'll actually start as a faculty in engineering at Rice next year. Um, so one of the things that we're trying to change is that we're trying to pick up more hobbies. We're just, you know, we're deprived of that. So we need to pick up more hobbies, and tennis was definitely one part of that.
Let's see. The next question is, how do you want to be remembered?
Uh, could you like, by anybody, like by students or people like my friends?
Um, yeah, if you could specify it for students and then maybe everybody else.
I see. For students, I want to remember as somebody who in my class that they thought about things a little bit differently than they would have if they did not take the class. I don't think there is anything that they need to remember or memorize from my class. But if they think about my class and they were like, oh, that gave me a lot of questions. The questions that I could talk about with my roommate, kind of in a very intellectual way, on Saturday night. That's kind of what I want my students to get out of. So and I try to structure my class that way. So hopefully they get that out of that. Um, Other friends and family, other people, like I've been kind of the running theme is like I've been very blessed with the people as well as kind of material stuff. So I hope that I like at the end of the day I have given them more than I have been given. So that you know that they really felt like that they had a good friend because they a lot of them are my good friends and they really kept me going. So um hopefully I can do the same.
You see. And to move on to the last part of the interview, and this will be about a little bit of advice for the future generations. Do you have any advice for Asian American students in general, and also for those who are hoping to pursue a career in business and or teaching?
Yeah. Well, as kind of so obviously my experience as an Asian American student in high school, college, and beyond is obviously, just one experience. I think many Asian American students have different kinds of experience. So, just this, to take it as just one answer, one perspective. I like to say that like, struggling is okay. Like struggling as, feeling like that you are not part of something that's like quote unquote more mainstream or feeling like that you have to, kind of escape Asian Americanness. Um, Feeling like that is okay. I think a lot of Asian American students, not a lot, maybe like some that I have known before, some struggle with the fact that they feel that way and they feel guilty about that. Um, and I think kind of feeling that way is okay, because it's not like you're betraying, the Asian American community or your racial or ethnic identity. It's more that it's just part of how the society is structured that we're essentially we are taught to kind of go through that struggle, and I still struggle with that, I'm sure. I still struggle with that, and um so that I think that's essentially what I would say to people who pursue things in the business and teaching. I think for the latter, for life in academia, like I say, just give it a try, like at the same time, like, feel free to quit after, trying it and not liking it. I think academia is one of the fields that giving a try is easy. It's relatively costless. You can do it during college. So I think that's the best way to do it. Um, yeah, so that's what I would say.
I see. And the next question is, if you could go back in time and give a piece of advice to your younger self, what would it be?
I think part of it is kind of the kind of the advice that I would say, like, which is the struggling was is okay. Um, I think another part is this is relatively trivial, but I was very uptight when I was in high school and college. Like I was like, even in college, I didn't, drink much because I thought that I would need to study more or something like that. I think I would let loose a little bit more. I think that's okay because, you know, if for nothing, like you can't do that like when you're working, like so I think college definitely is time for exploring, or or high school, and kind of the younger self is definitely time for exploring and getting lost is okay. I think I was very afraid to get lost. And I think I would tell my younger self that it is okay to get lost a little bit as well.
Yeah, those are all the questions I prepared, but did you have anything else that you wanted to add on?
Um, I think the more so I've lived like you said, I've lived in Colorado, Chicago, Boston, and back to Chicago, and then Houston. It's like essentially my fourth kind of place in the US. The more I move around, the more I appreciate the Asian American community, even though I might not be an active member in kind of the Asian American community in Houston. And kind of conversations like this kind of really kind of help me kind of think more about it. I think it's it's something that I can always think about it a little bit more. And so even when you kind of like sent me an email for this interview, kind of puts me in different perspectives. And then like I would have thought differently if I got this email 5 years ago or 10 years ago or something. And I'm sure I'll think about it differently 5 years later. So this kind of project, and as I was kind of thinking about this, I watched some of these kind of the HAAA interviews. And they definitely kind of made me think about different things about the Asian American community, even about the Asian American community within Rice University. So um I really appreciate this opportunity too.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating in this interview. I will